Zane Maddox had never quite figured out how he ended up in the remote corners of the galaxy, on a station like Zelveroth, a place full of alien species, strange politics, and an overwhelming sense of detachment from everything that had once been his world. A soldier once, now just a mechanic, scraping by on repairs and odds and ends. The scars of his past still haunted him. Earth was gone, a distant memory, a casualty of a long, drawn-out war. But here on Zelveroth Station, he'd built something resembling a life, though it was far from peaceful. Zelveroth wasn't a peaceful place. It was a bustling hub teeming with creatures from every corner of the galaxy. Every species imaginable was housed here, merchants, scientists, and warriors, each carrying their own brand of ambition, but none of them more proud than the Galactic Peacekeeper Academy. The Academy was the galaxy's finest institution, a place where only the most elite beings were allowed to enter, all in the name of peace. They kept the galaxy balanced, and their methods were traditional. Zane's world was the grease, the bolts, the engines. He was used to working in the shadows, not making waves, but all of that was about to change. He had no idea that his life was about to collide with the most terrifying creatures the galaxy had ever seen. It all started one morning with a simple message. The Peacekeepers, a group of highly disciplined, militaristic aliens, had a job offer for him. They needed someone like him, someone from Earth, to be the new trainer for Classroom Gamma. At first, Zane thought it was a joke. Who would want him, a grizzled ex-soldier turned mechanic, as a teacher? But this wasn't just any classroom. The cubs who were housed there weren't regular students. They were Threxel cubs, highly dangerous, nearly unstoppable creatures known across the galaxy for their strength, aggression, and razor-sharp claws. The Peacekeepers had trained them to be the galaxy's elite warriors. And the worst part, they were children, just barely old enough to understand the difference between play and destruction. Zane didn't know what to expect walking into the classroom that morning. He was just an outsider, a human. There was no place for his kind in the Peacekeeper Academy. Most humans, like Zane, had been left to rot after the war. The galaxy didn't see them as much more than a distant memory, an afterthought, but this was an opportunity. Zane couldn't back down from a challenge, especially not when the job was handed to him. The door slid open with a hiss and Zane stepped inside. The first thing that hit him was the smell, something musky and feral. The second thing was the silence. It was too quiet for a classroom full of children. And then the eyes, 9 pairs of glowing, curious eyes stared at him from every corner of the room. Their pupils dilated as they sized him up, tiny, unblinking, intelligent eyes. Zane felt his heart race. He couldn't let fear show. These weren't normal kids, and he wasn't going to treat them like normal kids. A soft growl rumbled from the center of the room. It was low, like a distant thunderstorm, yet sharp enough to freeze the air in his lungs. Garina, the alpha cub, stepped forward. Her fur was a wild mess of dark brown and black, and her tail twitched with anticipation. Zane's eyes met hers for a moment. It was a test, an unspoken challenge. "Morning, little ones," Zane said, his voice steady. He was wearing his usual work clothes, soft flannel pajamas with faded pictures of spaceships on them. He'd never thought about it much before, but in this moment the familiar comfort of his pajamas felt like a joke. They were the only thing he could rely on, the only part of his routine that remained unchanged. The cubs sniffed the air, the scent of cocoa and sleep lingering around him like an odd combination of peace and vulnerability. They didn't know what to make of him. "Is this the place?" Zane asked, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was calm, soft, and to his surprise it echoed in the silent room. One of the cubs, a small, scruffy one named Rek, took a tentative step forward, his claws clicking softly against the floor. There was an almost playful glint in his eyes, but Zane knew better than to trust that innocence. These cubs were predators. Garina, the alpha, growled again. It wasn't a welcoming sound, but Zane didn't flinch. He wasn't sure if it was a good idea to back down, but that's what he had been taught on Earth: stand your ground, even if it means facing down something you can't possibly beat. The door hissed closed behind him, sealing him in with these creatures. It was a one-way ticket, and he had no choice but to play along. He sat down on the nearest cushion, not making any sudden movements. His heart beat loud in his ears, but he didn't let his mind wander into fear. No, he had dealt with too much on Earth, too many close calls, too many enemies to let a group of alien cubs rattle him. Besides, Zane wasn't afraid of monsters. He was one himself once. "Hey there," he murmured, his hand resting on his knee. "I'm your new friend." A low growl from Garina, but Zane didn't back down. Instead, he pulled out his thermos of cocoa and unscrewed the cap. The sweet, warm scent filled the room, an odd contrast to the ferocity surrounding him. It was a risk, he knew that. In this room, the slightest wrong move could trigger an attack, and yet Zane kept his focus on the cubs. It was the only way to get through to them. He'd learned that much in his years as a soldier. Sometimes, the best way to face an enemy was not with weapons, but with calm. The cubs began to edge closer, drawn in by the scent of the cocoa, sniffing and pawing at the ground. Garina remained still, her eyes never leaving Zane. Slowly, Zane reached into his pajama pocket, pulling out a book, a real one, frayed and worn at the corners. The cover depicted a child riding a giant dog through the stars. "You want a story?" Zane asked, his voice soft, steady. He opened the book to the first page and began to read in a low, calming tone, the words coming easily as if they were second nature. He wasn't sure why, but he believed in the power of stories, in the power of calming someone through words. And for the first time since entering the room, the cubs stopped moving. Zane looked up, watching as Garina, who had been so aggressive moments before, crept closer. Then another cub and another until they were gathered around him, no longer growling or snarling. They were listening, they were quiet. Outside, behind the observation glass, a group of peacekeepers, Krell, Ishin, Velver, and the others, watched in disbelief. Weapons were at the ready, just in case Zane's calm was a facade. Zane kept reading, not looking up. The story continued, his voice never wavering. His pajamas didn't seem so silly now. If anything, they were a symbol of something the cubs could relate to, something soft, something comforting. And then one of the cubs, the smallest, Fenfin, climbed onto his lap, curled up, and fell asleep. Zane barely breathed, careful not to disturb the fragile moment. The peacekeepers were still staring at the monitors, unsure of what they were witnessing. Was it working? Was it some sort of trick? But Zane didn't care. He simply continued reading, his voice echoing in the silence, the soft thrum of the cubs breathing the only sound. The moment Krell entered the room, the energy shifted. The cubs, who had been so still and calm just moments before, suddenly stirred. The noise was subtle at first, a soft shuffle of claws on the floor, the quiet rustling of fur, but it was enough to make Zane's heart skip a beat. He kept his gaze fixed on Garina, the alpha cub, whose eyes were still locked on him, as if she were silently daring him to make the wrong move. Krell's presence was commanding, like the storm that preceded a hurricane. Her three-segmented torso shifted as she adjusted the harness of her battle armor, making her look both terrifying and powerful. Zane didn't flinch. He had faced bigger threats than this. He knew how to handle the heat, even when the odds were stacked against him. "You can't keep doing this," Krell repeated, her tone sharp, demanding. "The cubs need discipline, they don't need your distractions." Her eyes scanned the room, making sure every one of the cubs was in view. Zane stood up slowly, careful not to disturb the cubs on his lap. Fenfin, the smallest of the group, was still sleeping soundly, curled into a ball. Garina was on all fours, her head tilted slightly as she studied Krell with a mix of curiosity and distrust. "Distractions?" Zane asked, his voice calm but firm. He wiped the sleep from his eyes, not bothering to hide his exhaustion. "These cubs are dangerous, I get it, but if you think that more violence and punishment is going to help them, then you're looking at them all wrong." Krell's jaw tightened. "These cubs are born for combat. The Academy trains them for a purpose. You think you can change that with some soft stories and cocoa? They'll eat you alive before you can finish a sentence." Zane didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the cubs, their soft, innocent faces now mirroring the tension in the room. He had always believed that real strength came from understanding, not from force. These cubs were no different. They needed guidance, not brute force. "I know what I'm doing," Zane said, his voice quieter now but no less determined. "You can't train them for peace by using fear." Krell's patience was thinning, but before she could respond, Ishin Velver, a peacekeeper officer with a reputation for cruelty, stepped into the room. His black and silver armor glinted under the artificial lights, his red eyes scanning Zane with disdain. "You've gone too far, Earthborn," Ishin sneered, his voice thick with venom. "This method of yours, it's not peacekeeping, it's surrender, and you are making the cubs weak." Zane met Ishin's gaze, feeling the weight of every word. The tension between the two was palpable, as if the air itself was charged with a static hum. Maybe what you call weakness is actually the first step toward real peace. Krell raised a hand, signaling for silence. She turned toward Zane, her eyes sharp and calculating. "The cubs need to learn discipline, and I'll be damned if you think you can teach them anything with your pajama method." Zane felt the sting of her words, but he didn't back down. He had seen enough of war to know what it looked like, what it did to people, to children. He'd learned the hard way that the first step to building peace wasn't by conquering others, it was by creating a space where trust could grow. "Not everyone needs to wear armor to be strong," he said quietly, glancing at the cubs again. "I'm not here to make them soldiers, Krell, I'm here to make them something better." Krell's expression softened just slightly, but it was enough to make Zane feel like he'd scored a small victory. Ishin, on the other hand, was not pleased. "You're wasting time," Ishin growled. "If you won't act as a proper peacekeeper, you'll be removed, it's that simple." But Krell, for reasons unknown to Zane, didn't respond immediately. She stood in the doorway, her gaze flicking between Ishin and Zane. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but resolute. "We'll let the cubs decide." Training the cubs. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in Classroom Gamma shifted again. Zane's unconventional methods, his soothing tone, his willingness to get down on their level, and the steady, patient way he interacted with them began to produce surprising results. The cubs responded to him in ways that defied their violent instincts. It wasn't perfect, of course. They were still cubs, curious, playful, and unpredictable, but the transformation was undeniable. Zane spent hours reading to them, letting them curl up against him as he spoke. Sometimes they'd gnaw on his sleeves or paw at his thermos of cocoa, but he never lost his patience. He learned their subtle cues, the twitch of an ear when they were frustrated, the soft growl that indicated fear, the way they'd soften when he spoke in a calm, steady voice. He took the time to understand them, to show them that there was no need to fear him. It wasn't just about the cubs, it was about the culture they came from. They had been raised to believe that violence was the only way to assert strength, to gain respect. Zane realized that if he could show them a different way, they might just become something more than soldiers. But the peacekeepers were watching and they were skeptical. During one of the training exercises, Zane's methods were put to the test. The Cubs were set to undergo their first field simulation where they would face off against hostile forces, alien mercenaries hired to test their combat readiness. The idea was simple: show their worth or be eliminated from the program. Zane was told to prepare them as best as he could, but he refused to follow the standard peacekeeper approach. Instead of teaching them how to fight, Zane focused on teamwork and strategy. He worked with the Cubs, guiding them through the basics of communication, trust, and cooperation. They learned how to cover each other's backs, how to use their strength not to destroy but to protect. When the simulation began, Zane wasn't sure what to expect. The Cubs, now somewhat accustomed to his methods, behaved differently than the peacekeepers had anticipated. They moved together as a unit, their agility and strength serving not to overpower the enemy but to outsmart them. They didn't fight blindly, they adapted, using their environment and their instincts to create a strategy. And when the simulation ended, it wasn't just a victory in the traditional sense. The Cubs had succeeded, but it was the manner in which they succeeded that caught everyone off guard. They hadn't destroyed everything in their path, they had used their intelligence and teamwork to outmaneuver the enemy. Zane stood back, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and pride. The Cubs had done something incredible. They had shown the peacekeepers that there was more to strength than raw power. There was value in understanding, in adapting, in growing beyond what was expected of them. The High Commander stood in the doorway, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the room. The Cubs, still quietly gathered around Zane, seemed to sense the tension in the air. For the first time in days, they stopped moving altogether, their eyes flicking between the High Commander and Zane, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Zane could feel his pulse quicken. The High Commander's presence was commanding, his gaze sharp and calculating. He had seen the results of Zane's unconventional methods, but there was something about them that felt unsettling. Zane's heart pounded as he stood there, unsure of what the High Commander's words would bring. "Zane Maddox," the High Commander began, his voice like thunder. "You've shown us something remarkable here. The Cubs, who are meant to be weapons of war, have responded to your method. But you've also shown us that we've been too rigid in our thinking. Your approach, it challenges everything we've believed about strength, discipline, and peace." Zane swallowed hard, knowing this was the moment that would define everything. Would the peacekeepers see his methods as a threat, or would they finally understand that a new path was possible? "I don't want to destroy them," Zane said, his voice steady. "I want to help them grow. They deserve a future where they're not just tools for war, where they can learn to be more than just fighters. They can be peaceful if we let them." The High Commander narrowed his eyes, considering Zane's words. The room was thick with tension, and Zane could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him. "You want to turn them into children," the High Commander replied, his voice hard. "You want to take away their aggression, their survival instinct. Do you understand what you're asking?" "I'm asking for a chance," Zane replied, his voice unwavering. "A chance for them to choose who they want to be, not for their instincts to decide for them." There was a pause, a long silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then the High Commander spoke again, his tone softer but no less heavy. "You've given us an interesting proposition, Earthborn, but your methods are untested. The stakes are too high for the Cubs and for the galaxy. There is a mission coming, a test if you will. The Cubs will be sent to a live combat zone where their training will be put to the test, and you will lead them." Zane's heart sank. He had feared something like this would happen. The Cubs, despite all his efforts, were still seen as weapons, and he was being asked to prove that his methods could work in real combat. "Are you telling me you want me to train them for war?" Zane asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've been through." "Not war," the High Commander replied, his eyes cold. "We want you to prove that your approach can work in a real situation. You will lead them through a combat mission. If you succeed, we'll consider allowing you to continue your methods. If you fail, the Cubs will be returned to traditional training, and you will be removed from the program." Zane's mind raced. A live combat zone. There was no way the Cubs were ready for something like that. They were children, for all their strength and aggression. They had barely started to understand what it meant to be a team, let alone fight together as soldiers. But there was no way out. The peacekeepers had made their decision. Zane turned to the Cubs. Garina, Rek, and the others were watching him intently, waiting for his next move. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty. They didn't understand what was happening, but they trusted him. At least he hoped they did. "This is it, kids," Zane said softly, his voice more for their benefit than his own. We've got one shot at this. If we succeed, we show them that there's a better way to be strong, but we need to work together. No matter what happens, we stick together. Garina let out a low growl, her tail twitching in response. The cubs were ready. They had trained for this in their own way. They weren't soldiers, not yet, but they were becoming something else, something more than just the sum of their instincts. Krell stepped forward, her eyes cold. You'll leave for the combat zone tomorrow. Prepare yourselves. Zane looked at her, then back at the cubs. This was the test, the moment where everything would either fall apart or fall into place. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't go back, not now. The combat zone. The next morning, Zane stood at the helm of a sleek transport ship. The cubs arrayed behind him in their light combat armor, eyes full of both fear and anticipation. They had never been in real combat before, not like this. The mission was simple: infiltrate a hostile alien outpost on the edge of the galaxy, disable their weapons systems, and gather intelligence. The cubs' task was to neutralize any threats without killing. Zane looked out the window as the transport ship descended toward the surface of the planet. The terrain was rugged, with jagged mountains and dense toxic forests stretching as far as the eye could see. The air outside the ship was thick with smoke, the remnants of a long-running war between two rival factions. The cubs were suited up, each one carrying a small weapon, nothing lethal, just enough to subdue an opponent. Zane had taught them how to fight in close quarters without causing serious harm. They could incapacitate, disarm, or subdue without killing, but in a real combat situation there was no room for mistakes. One wrong move and everything would fall apart. Remember, Zane said as the ship landed, we don't fight to destroy, we fight to stop the threat and protect each other. You've got this. The doors of the transport opened, and the cubs surged forward, eager to prove themselves. Zane followed, stepping into the thick air of the alien planet, the smell of smoke and sulfur burning his nose. The first few minutes were quiet, too quiet. The cubs moved in a tight formation, their eyes darting between the trees and the distant ruins. Zane kept them moving, his every sense alert. His human instincts told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't place it. The cubs, for once, were silent. They were focused, each one watching the other's backs. Then the ambush came. A group of heavily armed mercenaries appeared from the shadows, firing blaster bolts in every direction. The cubs scattered, instinctively seeking cover. Zane's heart raced as he watched them move fast, efficient, working together as a team. They weren't just fighting, they were thinking. Zane shouted orders, guiding them through the chaos, directing them where to go. Garina lunged at one of the mercenaries, her claws outstretched, but Zane was there first, using his quick reflexes to knock the weapon from the mercenary's hand. Fenfin, the smallest cub, darted past him, wrapping around the mercenary's legs and tripping him. Zane's heart swelled with pride. They were working together. But then, just as the tide began to turn, a blaster shot rang out. Rek, who had been charging at another mercenary, collapsed to the ground, a small burn mark on his side. Zane's world tilted. He rushed to Rek's side, cradling the cub in his arms. The cub let out a weak growl but was still breathing. Stay with me, Rek, Zane whispered, his voice steady despite the rising panic. We're not done yet. The fight wasn't over. The ground shook violently beneath Zane's feet, the tremors almost knocking him off balance as he cradled Rek in his arms. His heart hammered in his chest, not just from the immediate danger but from the realization of what was happening. The creature stalking toward them wasn't just a regular threat, it was something far worse. A colossal alien, towering over 9 feet tall, with leathery green skin and jagged armor-like plates across its back. Its eyes glowed an ominous red, and a low, guttural growl reverberated through the trees, sending a shiver of dread through Zane's spine. The cubs, momentarily distracted by the mercenaries they had been fighting, froze at the sight of the creature. They'd faced predators before, but nothing like this. Zane's first instinct was to shout for everyone to fall back, but he quickly realized that would be pointless. The creature was too large, too fast. There was no running from it. They had to fight. Garina, Fenfin, get to cover, Zane shouted, his voice as calm as he could make it, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But the cubs didn't move. They were frozen, watching the creature, their instincts fighting with their training. They had been taught to fight to survive, but they hadn't been trained to face something this big. And yet Zane could see something in their eyes, fear, but also a desire to prove themselves. Zane, we need to get them out of here, Jory, his alien ally and fellow peacekeeper, shouted, appearing from behind a nearby rock. She had been covering them during the initial assault but had come rushing over when she saw the creature emerge. Her face was grim, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes. Zane shook his head, his grip on Rek tightening as the cub let out a low whine. We can't leave them, Jory, they're part of this now. Jory hesitated, then nodded. She understood. Zane wasn't just fighting for his survival anymore. He was fighting for the cubs, for everything he had tried to teach them. The creature let out a deafening roar, its massive claws tearing through the ground as it charged toward them. Zane had no time to think. He needed to act, and he needed to act now. Listen to me, Zane shouted, standing tall despite the fear gnawing at his insides. This is our test. We're not just peacekeepers, we're a team, and we fight together. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The cubs were still, as if trying to process what Zane had just said. Then brave, stubborn Garina took a step forward, her claws unsheathing. Her tail was bristling with energy, and Zane could see the resolve in her eyes. She was ready. The other cubs followed suit, their hesitation falling away. They had spent days under Zane's guidance, learning how to trust, how to work as a team. It wasn't about raw aggression anymore, it was about using their heads. Zane's heart surged with pride as the cubs took their positions. Garina and Rek moved to the creature's flank, their small but agile bodies darting between trees, trying to confuse the massive alien. Fenfen and the others moved to the rear, setting up makeshift traps in the underbrush, something Zane had taught them to do in the simulation exercises. They weren't just going to fight this thing head-on, they were going to outsmart it. Zane, keeping his focus on the creature, tried to assess its weak points. Its thick hide was nearly impenetrable, and its speed was deceptive for something so large. But there was one thing the cubs had that the creature didn't: teamwork. "Jory, cover us," Zane barked, his mind racing. Jory nodded, her weapons raised as she began to fire at the creature, not to hurt it, but to distract it, drawing its attention away from the cubs. Zane didn't hesitate. He charged toward the creature, his eyes locked onto Garina and Rek, who had successfully flanked it. Garina launched herself at the creature's side, leaping onto its back, while Rek darted in, biting and clawing at the creature's legs. The creature roared in pain, but it wasn't enough to stop it. With a single vicious swipe, it knocked Garina off its back, sending her tumbling to the ground. "Garina!" Zane shouted, fear rising in his chest. He sprinted toward her, his heart in his throat. But the cub wasn't done yet. Garina, dazed but undeterred, scrambled to her feet, her eyes full of fury. She rushed at the creature again, this time with more strategy. She had learned, and so had the others. The cubs weren't acting out of instinct anymore, they were acting as a team. Zane reached Garina just in time to see her leap onto the creature's back once more, this time with Rek leaping up beside her, using his sharp claws to climb up the alien's side. The creature was off balance now, reeling from the multiple blows it had taken. Now, Zane shouted to Jory, who was in position. She aimed her weapon at the creature's eyes, and with a precise shot she disabled its vision, causing the creature to stagger backward, blinded and disoriented. Zane seized the opportunity. He rushed forward, ducking beneath the creature's flailing claws, and using his engineering skills, he quickly rigged an old piece of scrap metal into a makeshift net launcher. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would give them time to finish this. With a quick pull of the lever, the net shot out, wrapping around the creature's legs and pinning it to the ground. The cubs immediately moved in, working together to subdue the massive alien. They didn't kill it, they simply incapacitated it, a victory born of precision and patience, not violence. Zane stood panting, sweat dripping down his face. The fight was over. The aftermath. The creature lay motionless on the ground, its once terrifying presence reduced to a helpless heap. Zane's heart was still racing, but there was a sense of relief in the air. The cubs had done it. They had faced a threat that should have been insurmountable, and they had overcome it together. The peacekeepers, who had been watching from the perimeter, slowly began to lower their weapons. Krell, her stern face softening for the first time since Zane had arrived, stepped forward, her eyes scanning the cubs. They were bruised and scratched, but they were alive, and they had proven themselves. Ishan Velver stood off to the side, watching the aftermath with a hard expression. He didn't speak, but Zane could see the disbelief in his eyes. He had underestimated them all. Zane walked over to Garina, who was panting heavily but still standing tall. She looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude and something deeper: trust. "You did good, Garina," Zane said softly, his hand resting on her head. "You did more than good." The other cubs gathered around, all showing signs of exhaustion but also a sense of pride. They had been trained for war, but they had chosen a different path. They had shown that there was strength in unity, in compassion, in calm. The rumble from the sky grew louder, shaking the very foundations of Zelveroth Station. Zane stood still, his eyes locked on the horizon where a fleet of warships appeared, their sleek, menacing forms blotting out the stars. They were massive, each ship adorned with dark insignia, a clear symbol of the warlords of Zirakar, a notorious faction known for their ruthless conquests and brutal military tactics. The peacekeeper leadership had gone from tense to panicked in mere seconds. Zane could hear the sharp crackle of comms as commanders barked orders, their voices tight with anxiety. It was chaos. The cubs, still shaken from the recent battle, huddled together in a protective circle, their eyes darting between Zane and the approaching ships. They were scared, but they trusted him. "We need to act fast," Krell barked, her voice commanding even amidst the panic. She had her battle armor back on, the hardened plating glinting as she moved with military precision. "We can't afford to wait for them to make the first move." Zane's heart raced. He wasn't a soldier anymore, he was a mechanic, but he'd learned a thing or two about tactics in his past life. As much as he wanted to focus on protecting the cubs, he couldn't ignore the larger threat. I'll handle the cubs, Jory said, her eyes filled with determination. You focus on stopping them. Zane turned to her, his gaze steady. We don't have the resources for a full-on assault. If we try to take them head-on, we'll lose. I know, Jory replied, her voice soft but resolute. But we don't have a choice. This isn't just about the cubs anymore. It's about stopping these warlords before they turn this entire sector into a war zone. The High Commander, who had been overseeing the situation from the command center, appeared next to Krell, his face drawn with concern. We don't have enough forces to confront them directly, but we do have something they don't, the cubs. If we can use them strategically, we might be able to turn the tide. Zane's stomach twisted. The High Commander was right. The cubs had already proven themselves in the field, but using them as pawns in this conflict felt wrong. They weren't just soldiers, they were children who had learned from him that strength didn't always mean violence. But in the face of the warlords, Zane knew there was no time for idealism. This wasn't just a test for the cubs, it was a test for the entire galaxy. We'll need to move quickly, Zane said, his voice calm. Get the cubs into position, I'll work on setting up some traps. We're going to give them a fight they'll never forget. Krell gave him a sharp nod, her eyes narrowing. We'll use the terrain to our advantage, get to it. The battle plan. As the warlord fleet continued its approach, Zane set to work, pulling together everything he knew about survival and strategy. He wasn't a general, but he had something the peacekeepers didn't, an understanding of improvisation, of using what was available, and of thinking outside the box. Zane quickly assembled a series of traps using spare equipment he had lying around the station, a mixture of makeshift explosive devices, motion-triggered snares, and basic mechanical sabotage. The cubs, under the supervision of Jory, began setting up a perimeter around the station, working with precision and focus that Zane had never seen from them before. They had learned to cooperate, to act as a team, and now they would have to prove it. As Zane worked, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. These cubs, these dangerous creatures, were no longer mindless soldiers. They were showing courage, intelligence, and above all, trust. They trusted him. They had come a long way since their violent, untrained days in Classroom Gamma. But that trust would be put to the ultimate test. The warlords weren't here for diplomacy, they were here to destroy. Zane walked to the top of the station's observation tower, the wind biting at his face. The massive fleet loomed overhead, their engines cutting through the atmosphere with a deafening hum. Ships of all sizes and shapes hovered in the sky, their weapons locked and ready. Jory stood beside him, her face calm but grim. This isn't just about the cubs anymore, Zane. The entire station is at risk. If we fail, it's not just us we're protecting. We'll be saving every living being on this station. Zane nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. He wasn't just trying to keep the cubs alive anymore. He was trying to change the course of history, to show that a different kind of peace was possible. A peace built on compassion, understanding, and teamwork, not violence. We'll make it through, Zane said, his voice steady. We have to. The cubs have learned more than we ever expected. Jory glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You've changed them, you've changed all of us. Zane didn't have time to respond. The sound of a massive ship descending broke through the air. The warlords were landing. The ambush. The warlords began their descent in a series of synchronized movements, their ships opening up to reveal heavily armored soldiers. These weren't just mercenaries. These were elite warriors, highly trained, relentless, and ruthless. They began to spread out across the station, setting up heavy weaponry and scouting the area for threats. Zane watched from the observation tower as the cubs began to move into position. They were ready. They had trained for this moment, and now they were about to put everything they had learned to the test. Now, Zane muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He pressed a button on his wristband, activating the first of the traps. A loud crack echoed across the station, followed by a burst of light as the first warlord soldier was thrown off balance by an explosive device hidden in the ground. The cubs, reacting instantly, sprang into action. Garina, Rek, and the others darted forward, using their agility and speed to overwhelm the warlord soldiers. Zane had trained them to be quick, precise, and strategic. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting to prove that there was another way. The battle erupted into chaos. Blaster shots echoed and explosions rang out as the cubs worked in perfect harmony with the peacekeepers. Zane moved through the battle, coordinating the cubs, guiding them with his voice, ensuring they stayed calm amidst the madness. It was a delicate balance, one wrong move and they could lose everything. But the warlords weren't backing down. They had anticipated resistance, and their heavy weapons soon began to turn the tide in their favor. Zane watched in horror as one of the cubs, Fenfen, was knocked back by a blast, her small body flying through the air. She landed with a painful thud against a wall, but Zane could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't out, not yet. Zane rushed to her side, kneeling next to the injured cub. Fenfen, stay with me, he whispered, his hand gently resting on her head. She let out a weak growl, her eyes still full of fight. But the situation was getting worse by the second. The warlords were advancing, their soldiers moving with calculated precision. Zane could feel the weight of the battle pressing down on him. They were outnumbered, and the cubs were getting exhausted. The ground trembled beneath Zane's feet as the looming presence of Ishin Velver grew ever more menacing. The warlord flagship continued to hover above the station, its weapons trained on the core, ready to unleash destruction at any moment. Zane's heart raced as he took in the scene. His worst fear had come to pass. Ishin, a high-ranking peacekeeper officer who had relentlessly opposed Zane's methods from the beginning, had allied himself with the warlords. "I told you this would happen," Ishin said, his voice filled with venom. "The cubs were never meant for peace, they were made for war. You failed them, Earthborn, and now we'll finish what you started." Zane clenched his fists, refusing to let fear dictate his actions. His mind raced as he assessed the situation. The cubs were still scattered across the battlefield, engaging the warlord soldiers, but they were exhausted. Some were injured, their energy running low after hours of combat. If they kept fighting this way, they wouldn't last much longer. "Ishin," Zane said, his voice calm but filled with steel. "This isn't about war, this is about peace. These cubs aren't weapons, they're children, and you," he stopped himself, narrowing his eyes. "You've become the very thing you swore to fight against." Ishin's eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, his hand hovering over the control pad of his communicator. "You've become a liability, Zane, and for that, I'm going to see you and your precious cubs eradicated." Zane's blood ran cold. Ishin wasn't just a peacekeeper, he was a dangerous zealot, blinded by his own beliefs. And now Zane realized he had put the cubs in even more danger than they had been before. The warlords were attacking, and the peacekeeper leadership had betrayed them all. But Zane wasn't going to give up, not after everything he'd fought for. He turned to the cubs, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. "Listen to me, we've trained for this, we've prepared for this moment." He could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw the trust they had in him. They weren't just following orders, they were following him. "We fight together just like we practiced. No one gets left behind. We show them who we are, now go." With a unified roar, the cubs charged back into battle. They weren't fighting to destroy, they were fighting for their future, for the chance to prove they could be more than just weapons. The warlord soldiers were no match for the cubs' speed and agility. Garina, still leading the charge, leaped onto one of the soldiers, pinning him to the ground with surprising strength. Rek, her loyal second-in-command, darted through the chaos, using his claws to disable the warlord's weapons and disarm them one by one. Fenfin, despite her earlier injuries, was back in action, weaving through the soldiers and bringing them to the ground with swift, calculated movements. Zane, watching from the sidelines, felt a wave of pride rush over him. The cubs were learning, adapting just as he had hoped. They were no longer mindless beasts driven by their instincts. They were a team, they were a family, and they were fighting not for survival but for their right to live their lives the way they chose. However, the battle was far from over. As the cubs subdued the warlord soldiers, Zane knew the real challenge was still ahead: Ishin Velver. The final confrontation. Zane's eyes locked onto Ishin, who was standing at the center of the battlefield, his red eyes glowing with unrelenting fury. Behind him, the massive warlord ship loomed like a monstrous shadow. The alien soldiers that had allied with Ishin had been pushed back, but Ishin himself was still a threat. "You're too late, Earthborn," Ishin sneered, activating his wristband. The ground beneath them rumbled as the warlord flagship's cannons powered up. "The peacekeepers are done with you. This galaxy is ours for the taking." Zane stepped forward, his face hardening. "I'm not done yet, neither are the cubs." Ishin laughed, his voice cold. "You think these children, these monsters, are going to stop me? You're delusional. They've only learned to hide their true nature. They're predators, just like the rest of us." Zane clenched his jaw. "No, Ishin, they've learned the power of trust, and that's more than you'll ever understand." Ishin's expression twisted with anger. "You still think you can change the nature of war? You're an idiot." He pressed a button on his wristband, and the warlord flagship's cannons began to glow with an ominous, deadly energy. Zane didn't wait for Ishin to make the first move. "Jari," he shouted, "now." Jory, who had been working on deactivating the warlord ship's weapon systems, nodded and activated the signal. With a sharp, high-pitched hum, a series of EMP pulses shot out from the station, disabling the flagship's main weapon systems. The energy cannons sputtered and flickered, their power shutting down. Ishin's eyes widened in shock. "You think you can?" Zane didn't give him a chance to finish. He rushed forward, using the distraction to get within range. Ishin activated a shield generator on his wrist, but it was too late. Zane had already reached him, his hand grabbing the wristband and yanking it off. "You're finished," Zane said, his voice low and full of resolve. "Your war is over." Ishin fought back, but Zane was too quick. Using the techniques he had learned in his time with the cubs, he twisted Ishin's arm, bringing the officer to his knees. The cubs, seeing their moment, surged forward, disarming Ishin's remaining soldiers and forcing them to surrender. The tide had turned. The betrayal revealed. As Zane stood over Ishin, panting, Krell stepped forward, her face unreadable. She looked down at Ishin, her expression hardening. I never thought I'd see the day, she said softly, almost to herself. Ishin Velver, you were supposed to be one of the Peacekeeper's finest. Ishin glared up at her, his eyes filled with bitterness. You've made a mistake, Krell. You're letting these Earthborn corrupt everything. You'll see. There's no peace in this galaxy, not anymore. Krell turned to Zane, her expression still unreadable, but there was a faint glimmer of respect in her eyes. You were right, Earthborn, I see it now. It's not about making them soldiers, it's about giving them the chance to choose. Zane didn't say anything, he didn't need to. He looked at the cubs, at Garina, Rek, Fenfin, and he saw the future he had fought for, a future of peace, not through force but through understanding. The dust from the battlefield had barely settled before Zane realized the true weight of what had happened. The warlord fleet was in retreat, their forces shattered. Ishin Velver, once a trusted officer of the Peacekeeper Academy, lay in captivity, his plans for domination in ruins. The cubs, the once feared creatures of war, had proven something the galaxy hadn't been prepared for, that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the choice to stop the cycle of violence and fear. Zane stood with Krell and Jari, watching as the Peacekeeper forces secured the warlord's ships. The station, once on the brink of destruction, was beginning to return to some semblance of order. The cubs, tired but victorious, huddled together near the station's core. They were different now, not just soldiers in training, but beings with the potential to become so much more. You did it, Zane, Jori said, her voice soft with awe. You really did it. The cubs, they did it. Zane smiled, looking out at the horizon where the wreckage of the warlord fleet drifted in the distance. The galaxy for now was safe, but he knew it wasn't over, it would never be over. There would always be forces like Ishin, people who thought that strength came only through power and domination. But that wasn't his way. Zane turned to Jori, his expression steady. We did it together, the cubs, the peacekeepers, we all did. Krell, standing next to them, nodded, though her expression was still unreadable. The Peacekeeper Academy was founded on ideals of strength through order and control. What you've done here, Earthborn, it's changing the very foundation of what we've built. Zane's heart swelled with pride. He had always known there was another way, a way that valued compassion over violence, understanding over fear. And now, the galaxy was beginning to understand that too. The cubs had shown everyone that even the most ferocious creatures could choose a different path. But there was still a long road ahead. The future of the cubs. Later that evening, as the station began to recover from the battle, Zane walked into Classroom Gamma one last time. The cubs, their fur matted and their faces weary, were sitting in a circle, their eyes still bright despite the toll of the day. They were no longer the dangerous, unpredictable creatures they had once been. They had learned, grown, and proved themselves in ways that no one had thought possible. Garina, the alpha cub, looked up at Zane with a quiet intensity. She was no longer just a leader by instinct, she had become a true leader by choice, and Zane saw it. He saw how much they had all changed. I'm proud of you, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. You've proven what I knew all along, that you're more than what you were taught to be. You're not monsters, you're more than that. The cubs didn't say anything at first, but as they sat there in the soft glow of the station's lights, something unspoken passed between them. It was trust. The trust that Zane had worked so hard to build, not just between them, but with himself. Zane sat down on the floor with them, his legs crossed. There's still a lot of work ahead, he said, a smile tugging at his lips. We'll need to keep learning, keep growing, but we've made it this far. Rek, the smallest cub, waddled over to Zane and nudged him gently with his nose. Zane laughed, the sound rich with relief and joy. Yeah, Zane said, running his hand over the cub's soft fur, we've come a long way. Garina sat beside him, her massive body leaning against his side. Zane leaned back, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The cubs were no longer just creatures of instinct, they had become something more. They had a future now, one where they could choose their path. It wasn't just a victory for Zane. It was a victory for the cubs, for Jori, for the peacekeepers who had come to see the truth in his methods. And it was a victory for the galaxy. Maybe it wasn't the peace everyone had imagined, but it was real peace. Peace forged through trust, cooperation, and the willingness to change. The prize of peace. But Zane knew peace was never permanent. There would always be forces that sought to tear it down, to replace it with chaos. Ishin's betrayal had been a reminder that not everyone was ready for the kind of change Zane had fought for. Even though the warlords had been defeated, there would always be others who believed that power came from control, that the galaxy could only be held together by strength. Zane wasn't naive enough to believe that one victory would change everything. The galaxy was vast, filled with countless species, each with their own beliefs, their own histories. Some of them would never understand the lesson the cubs had taught them, that true strength came from unity, not dominance. But Zane knew one thing for certain. He would keep fighting, he would keep teaching. He would keep working to show the galaxy that there was another way. And the cubs, they would be his partners in that fight. They had learned the value of compassion, of empathy, and of teamwork. They weren't just soldiers, they were ambassadors for a new kind of peace. As Zane stood up, stretching his sore muscles, he looked around at the cubs, their tired faces full of determination. They were ready for whatever came next, and so was he. The future of the Peacekeepers. In the days that followed, Zane and the cubs were hailed as heroes. The Peacekeeper Academy was forced to reassess its training methods, and for the first time, the possibility of a new kind of peacekeeping force, one built on cooperation and empathy, became a reality. Krell, who had once been one of Zane's biggest critics, became his ally, advocating for a new era of peacekeepers, one where both strength and compassion could coexist. The galaxy watched as Zane and his team of cubs worked together to forge a path forward. They faced many challenges, from navigating the complex political landscapes of alien factions to dealing with resistance from those who still believed in the old ways of war. But through it all, Zane remained committed to the belief that peace was not something to be won through violence, but something to be earned through trust, understanding, and a willingness to change. As the years went by, the Cubs grew into leaders of their own, becoming respected figures within the peacekeeper ranks. They were no longer the wild, uncontrollable creatures they had once been. They were ambassadors of peace, showing the galaxy that even the most fearsome beings could choose a different path. Closing scene. Zane stood on the balcony of Zelviroth Station looking out at the stars. The galaxy stretched before him, vast and unknown. He had no illusions about the road ahead. There would always be those who fought for power, those who sought to tear down the fragile peace they had built. But Zane was ready. He had faced the worst of the galaxy and survived, and now with the Cubs by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would keep fighting for peace, and together they would prove that even the most monstrous creatures could learn to be something more. Zane turned, his eyes meeting Garina's. She sat beside him, her head resting against his side, calm and content. The other Cubs, now fully grown and standing tall, joined them. "We've got a long way to go," Zane said, his voice filled with determination. Garina growled softly as if in agreement. "Yeah," Zane smiled, "but we're ready." And as the stars shimmered above them, the future seemed just a little bit brighter.